Hello, my name is Big Bubble, and I sometimes go by the name of Simon, and this is a thoughts video. Now, I should probably say that this is probably a bit different than what you would expect. This is not a board game, though it's still something that plays on the table. We're going to be talking about Star Wars Edge of the Empire. Now, this is a role-playing game, similar to Dungeons and Dragons, and I thought I would just give my opinion on what I think about it, if I think it's a good system or not, and all that sort of jazz. Now, if you're expecting a board game, do not worry, that's going to be coming out after this video shortly. But for now, just sit back, relax, and let me talk you through why I think Star Wars Age of the Empire is a pretty damn good role-playing system. Now, for those that don't know, role-playing is very much D&D. You are essentially going to create a character, and you're then going to give them a class, a race, a talent, etc., and kind of flesh out your own personal character, and then you role play as a character while GM guides you through an adventure. That all sounds good so far, but where Star Wars does it a bit differently, where Fantasy Flight have done it a bit differently, is they actually have released 3 books. This one, Age of the Empire, came out in 2013. Then they released Age of Rebellion, and then they released Force and Destiny. Now, Age of the Empire is to deal with smugglers and scoundrels and the bandits of the Star Wars universe. Age of Rebellion is all to do with the movies, and that is the heroics of the Rebel Alliance versus the Empire. And Forces of Destiny is more a game, or it's the same system, but it's more focused towards the Force and far off planets to explore, full of strange and unique Force-like things. Surprised to say it's a bit wishy-washy sometimes, but it does play nicely with the Force, and if you want to play a Jedi character, that's the game you probably want to go for. So each book is kind of its own separate entity. It still follows the basic system, but they've differentiated by, say, giving you different classes depending on which book you're going for, different equipment most of the time. It's similar, I would say Age of Rebellion and Age of Empire is quite similar in terms of the equipment they give you, but they then go on to different things. So, for example, Age of Empire covers more of the Outer Rim worlds, if you know about Star Wars, more of the bandit worlds, whereas something like Age of Rebellion covers the worlds of the Rebel Alliance, essentially. So very much you're just picking out which theme or which kind of world you want to run it in. It's still Star Wars, and there is a bit of balancing between, do you want Star Wars canon stuff or do you want Star Wars legend stuff? Now, Fantasy Flight have kind of got permission to kind of go both ways. They kind of do draw a lot of inspiration off of the legend stuff, especially things like Knights of the Old Republic. But at the same time, they are respectful to the current canon universe in a sense. So that's the basics of it. However, what I like is just how much the book offers you. You see, I'm so used to Dungeons and Dragons where you get a player's handbook, then you have a monster's manual, then you have the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then you get a whole bunch of modules or basically add-ons for that give you more rules and give you more classes and give you more races. In a sense, that works well, but one of my biggest troubles with that is if you're a player, you really only need the player's handbook and one extra guide, which means that if you are, say, the GM or the guy doing the dungeon mastering stuff, it means you kind of have to buy a lot more things if you just want a lot more toys to play with. Whereas with this, you could just get this, Age of Rebellion, and Force and Destiny, and just have a lot of information to go on. Now, again, a lot of that information is repeated, but it's a very good starting point. And then you can obviously pick and choose which kind of route you want to follow. If your group wants to do a lot more smuggling and being pirates, you go for the Edge of the Empire. If your group is a lot more Jedi focused and want to explore the Force, you go for Force and Destiny. So there are nice choices to be made. Each book is generally the same in terms of how it is structured. It will explain combat, explain how the dice system works. That's now probably a good point to talk about the big thing about this game, and that is the dice system. You see, in Star Wars role-playing games, you don't roll dice. Well, you do, but the dice are not just your normal dice. They are these really weird and colorful custom dice, I want to say. Essentially, you have your skills. So say, for example, you're trying to do a ranged attack against someone. You're going to roll a certain number of green dice, which are your skill dice. You're going to roll a certain number of your purple dice, which are the difficulty of the doing. And then you're just going to compare symbols. And if you have certain symbols, you're going to then either succeed or fail. Now, this may seem quite complicated, and it is for the first time running. This is very not. It's it's weird, right? Because here's the thing: Star Wars is easy to sucker someone into playing this with you. If I went up to someone and be like, "Hey, do you want to do Dungeons and Dragons and create an elven archer?" People will kind of go, "Not really." But if I want to say, "Do you want to be Han Solo?" They'll be like, "Yeah." It's a lot easier to get people into this type of role playing system simply because the theme is so strong. It has to be. It is Star Wars. But this dice system is very clever, but it's not easy to get used to. You see, you essentially are looking at dice being rolled and then comparing symbols and seeing how many symbols cancel out each other. If you've played Star Wars Imperial Assault, or say Star Wars X-Wing, you're quite familiar with these kind of dice. They're essentially just dice that cancel each other out and eventually get a number in a sense. And so what's nice is combat kind of tends to be faster. Skill checks tend to be faster. And what's nice is the dice not only tell you if you say just simply succeed, but perhaps you've, for example, managed to generate yourself some advantage, or it could be a situation where you generate yourself, you might succeed, but you still get some threat. What this means narratively, and this is such a wonderful boon to GM, is that a person can succeed, but then all of a sudden there's a lot of threat generated, which means they might have succeeded at their task, but all of a sudden something dangerous has now appeared around the corner. For example, a person might be trying to hack open a door, and the door opens up because they're successful, but the alarm trips, and now all of a sudden 10 Imperial Stormtroopers are bounding down the hall because they've just been tipped off because you generated a whole bunch of threat. This also is an easy way to then spend stuff in combat. For example, I could say spend a threat on my opponent when you rolled this to say make him suffer a strain, which is a fancy way of saying stamina. Or for example, I could say I'm going to use 2 of my advantages to make the guy get knocked or get knocked prone. And you can still have access to other dice, which are these kind of boost dice, which again you can just use to say, hey, someone's helping you, or maybe a setback dice because, hey, it's raining and you're struggling to do the task you're doing. The dice is really the crux of the system. Everything evolves around it, but it never overcomplicates things. You see, every single time you do a skill check, it's always just going to be how many green dice I roll, how many purple dice I roll, and maybe I'll get 1 or 2 other dice. That is it for combat, for skill checks, for social encounters, for anything. You just simply are going to roll those dice. And what this means is you're not wasting time having to look up, okay, I hit with a weapon and now I have to work out my D4 to see if I actually hit the person, and then have to work out to see if I wound the person or not. It might seem complicated at first, but really when you get down to it, it's a lot simpler, and I like it. And it's just a nice different take off of a dice system that's used for role-playing games. You're not relying on your D10s or D12s or D20s. It's you rolling on these really cool, colorful dice. You have this force dice, which you get to roll at certain times. You might get to roll at the beginning of the game to see how your destiny is affected. And that's wonderful. It's a nice, different touch, which makes you feel like you're not playing this a simple Dungeons & Dragons game. You're playing something a bit more special. And I will say it makes it seem a bit more gamey. It makes it seem like a bit more of a board game or a tabletop game than it does to, say, a role-playing game. Now, that's not to say that you can't role-play. One of the things I found when running my sessions is that people tend to struggle getting into the roles of their character. Now, what helps that is you have certain things in the different books. For example, in Age of Empire, which we're mostly talking about now, players, when they create their backstories, will actually have obligations. So they might have an obligation to a crime lord. It might be a very big obligation, or it might just be a small one. But that's an easy way for them to be a part of the story that you're creating, because all of a sudden, if they are obligated to always help Jabba the Hutt, and Jabba the Hutt gives them a mission, if they say no, that's huge. That's huge. So this obligation system gives them so many perks at the beginning of the game. They're like, yeah, let me take all this obligation on me. But then they don't realize when it comes back to them, the player, they have to put out, or they are not going to get enough done. They have to try their best, and they have to pull off the role-playing elements in order to succeed, or else their character is not going to do well off. And of course, if you're familiar with Star Wars, you're just going to be easier. It's going to be easier to roleplay. You know, it's easy to say when Darth Vader shows up, he's just going to murder a whole bunch of people, and that's true for a lot of things. But when, for example, if you say a generic fantasy game, when a troll shows up, you're not really sure how big the troll is, if it's going to be a threat, if it's going to be scary. Star Wars gives you that shared context that is so needed for this type of role-playing game. One of the other things I like is just how much you actually get. For this book, you get everything you need for being a player and a GM and anything in between. You know, you get rules for crafting, you get rules for weaponry, you get rules for combat, you get rules for being a GM and how you should run a session, which is all great. It doesn't mean you have to buy 3 separate books. Now, on the other side, it does mean that you have to buy one book, which is kind of just a bit too big. I don't mean to complain about this, but I honestly wish they kind of just released, say, a standard rules book, and then they said, okay, now we're going to do the Age of the Empire book. Now we're going to do the Rebel Alliance book. I kind of wish they did that instead, so it wasn't so many rules repeated over and over again for the individual things. Now, what is nice, of course, is if you enjoy this campaign, you can just get more smuggler stuff. You can get more rebel stuff. You can get more Jedi stuff if you want to, more Jedi books. And it does give you a lot. Fantasy Flight have definitely gone out their way to make sure there's enough content here if you're a fan of Star Wars. Another thing to take away from this is simply just the amount of content you actually get in the game. One of my favorite things, and if you're looking at the picture right now, this is actually the Star Wars Age of the Empire beginner set. And it contains the basic rules for playing the game. It also gives you an adventure, and it gives you a whole bunch of tokens and maps to use. One of the biggest things I found when looking at the 5th edition D&D or Dungeons & Dragons starter set was they didn't really give you a lot. They gave you like 6 dice, a couple of pieces of paper to create a character on, or use some pre-made characters, and they just gave you 2 really flimsy rule books and a story. That didn't really feel enough, whereas this, you get a lovely manual and you get an adventure, which is a good adventure. I can't stress this enough. Fantasy Flight, whenever they put out a product like this, so whenever they put out the Star Wars Age of the Empire role-playing game, there's an adventure inside, so not a long adventure. I mean, these adventures will probably maybe take you 1 or 2 sessions to complete, or 4 hours. But that's so great, because if you're a GM for the first time, you have a session already planned. Same with if you buy, say, the player screen in front of you, that kind of blocks players' views. You get an adventure with that. If you buy another rules book, you get more adventures in that. And that's just a wonderful touch. It means you're not buying just simply a standalone book, which just gives you a whole bunch of fluff and nothing to really go on. One of my biggest complaints about the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons books was most of them were just kind of not good enough. A lot of them contained stuff for the DM, but a lot of it was just boring lore stuff. It wasn't like nice crunchy things like rules or situations that you can put in front of your players. So there's a lot of this like, this is the Waterdeep Harbor, and here you can find the harpers, and it wasn't good enough. So you ended up basically having 2 books you should actually buy, which was Volo's Guide to Everything and Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Volo's Guide to Monsters. Those are the 2 books you probably should buy, because those gave you the most content and usable content for both players and a GM. The other books from the series were just kind of not good enough, because they just didn't really give you enough content to go on. Sure, they had campaigns in them that you could go and obviously take your group through, but they were never really interesting campaigns. I think Curse of the Stride was the only interesting one. That's because you're dealing with a vampire. Whereas with every single Star Wars adventure that you get in every book that you buy and every product that you buy of this series, it feels like a Star Wars adventure. In one of the base games, you essentially are agents of a criminal syndicate hunting down a bounty hunter, and it feels so Star Wars, and that's great. Not to mention, though, if you, of course, own, say, Imperial Assault, then you have a whole bunch of miniatures and a whole bunch of map tiles to use in your stuff already, which saves you a lot of hassle of buying extra, miniatures to use if you're playing something like more like fantasy. Now, is it perfect? Not really. Again, like I said, the rules are sometimes a bit too complicated to really wrap your head around the first time. I mean, it probably took me about 5 separate